If you've been playing games for a while, you've probably played an RPG once or twice. And if so, you may have asked yourself the question, what actually makes a game an RPG? Many people over the years have tried to create a fitting definition for it, and yet whatever descriptions people come up with, it's never a one-size-fits-all. For each description there are always exceptions that don't fit or don't even make sense, which ultimately leads most people to give up and adopt a I know it when I see it approach to what an RPG is. Isn't that crazy? Like deep down we all know that doesn't make sense, right? You know it, I know it, and yet we keep going on using this ultimately meaningless term like we have no other choice. Like we're stuck with it and we should just accept it. Which is just stupid and we shouldn't have to stand for it. The whole point of having a term like that is so we have the ability to describe different gaming experiences. So if we can't pin down the exact meaning, then we should just get rid of it. It is time we get to the bottom of this. Let me start by giving you my definition first. I think that role-playing is all about coming up with a character and then performing actions or making decisions that are motivated by who that character is. So any game that's going to be a role-playing game should at the very least allow you to make a character and then give you choices that let you act out that character. So this basically removes any kind of game with a set main character and any game with only one ending. Knowing this, one of the dumbest definitions I've ever heard has been that every game is an RPG because you're role-playing as the character you control, which is just stupid. Like if I'm playing a Mario game, I'm not role-playing as Mario, I'm controlling him. Like if a Goomba is approaching me, I'm not thinking, oh, what would Mario do? Would he jump on the Goomba? Or maybe he would just jump over it. I don't know, he can't do much else. Controlling a video game character just isn't the same as being them. It's like when I'm driving a car and I turn left and I think to myself, I'm turning left. But it's not me who's turning left, it's the car. I'm not role-playing as the car, I'm controlling it. Also, role-playing isn't the same thing as being immersed. When you're playing a Batman Arkham game, you may feel like you're Batman, but it's not like you have the choice to play him out of character. You can't kill anyone. You can't choose to not save Gotham. You can only do what Batman would have done anyway. To be fair, that definition is really rare, and it's more of an attempt to try and encompass as many games under the RPG label as possible, as opposed to actually defining any actual design elements within those games. However, one of the oldest and most common definitions has to be that RPGs are games that have stats, levels, and experience points. These are often referred to as RPG elements. Now I get where this is coming from. This is coming from the fact that Dungeons & Dragons was the first RPG, which makes people think that any mechanic that exists in Dungeons & Dragons is therefore automatically an RPG mechanic. Makes sense, right? It sounds like it makes sense, but if you think about it, it really doesn't hold any water. Because the reason that Dungeons & Dragons has stats isn't because it's an RPG, it's because it's a game, and games need rules. D&D is a tabletop game, it is played with pen and paper. You can't play out the fights in real life, so you need rules to decide what happens in the game world. For example, if I'm playing as a fighter and I'm attacking an orc with my sword, am I going to hit them? Well, I don't know unless we have rules to decide that. And these rules come in the form of numbers. Strength, dexterity, HP, armor class, things like that. So really stats are just game mechanics used for deciding the outcome of scenarios. All games have stats. Super Mario Galaxy has stats. Mario has health, it only goes up to 3 or 6, but it's a number. It goes up and down. Mario has movement speed, he has jump height, most enemies basically have just 1 HP, and Mario basically has 0 defense, causing him to take 1 damage per hit. All of these are stats. They're numbers, but it doesn't make Super Mario Galaxy an RPG. Then take Overwatch. All characters in Overwatch have health. They have defense in the form of armor. They have movement speed. They have attacks that deal a certain amount of damage. Those attacks have a certain amount of range. When they get hit in their weak spot, their heads, they take critical damage, which you may think is different from critical hits in RPGs, but it's not, because again, D&D is a pen and paper game, so whether or not an attack crits depends on a dice roll. That's just how you decide random chance in those games. If I shoot an arrow in Dungeons & Dragons, whether or not it hits, misses or crits depends on a dice roll. But Overwatch is a dynamic 3D game, so whether an attack hits, misses or crits is in large part dependent on my aiming ability, not random chance. Every game ever made has some form of stats, because stats are just numbers, and every video game has numbers because they are made on computers, and computers are literally made of numbers. They think in numbers, they think in binary. Just because there isn't a screen with all of a character's stats neatly laid out doesn't mean the character doesn't have stats. Then there are experience bars. This is another one of those mechanics where people think it's an RPG mechanic because it first appeared in D&D, but really it's just a number. It's a number that when it goes up and it reaches another number, you get something. What does this have to do with role-playing? Nothing. Because this is not an RPG mechanic, it's a reward mechanic. In most games, filling an experience bar often gives you a level, but really it can be anything. In Overwatch, for example, when the experience bar fills up, you get a loot box. This is because experience bars are just a tool for the designers to give you certain rewards to the player, depending on whether or not they've taken certain actions in the game. It's a reward mechanic, a mechanic that rewards you when you do things the game designer wants you to do. So you see? Both of these mechanics are just things that happen in video games. They're just game mechanics. The Dungeons & Dragons has these mechanics isn't because it has role-playing, it's because it's a game. These mechanics put the G in RPG. At this point we really have to talk about this idea that everything in D&D is role-playing because it's an RPG. Because this is simply not true. Dungeons & Dragons doesn't just belong to the RPG genre, it belongs to many genres. In fact, most games belong to more than just one genre and will have elements from multiple genres. Like, what is the most common mechanic in D&D? What is the thing you do more than anything? Simple, turn-based combat. So really D&D is primarily a turn-based combat game. At least as long as that's how you want to play it. You see, because D&D is a pen and paper game, there really aren't any limits to how you want to play it. If all your friends care about is defeating monsters and getting loot, your D&D experience isn't going to have a lot of role-playing in it. But if your friends care more about storytelling and role-playing, you're not going to have a lot of combat. Depending on how you play the game, it can also be a dungeon crawler, a dating sim, a novel, a survival game, whatever you want. And that's the problem, right? Because video games can be played in so many different ways, it creates all kinds of communication issues. Take Skyrim, for example. Sure, it is possible to roleplay in it, but let's not kid ourselves. Most people that play this game, including me, mostly just go around doing quests and bashing enemies' brains in. Which can't really be described as role-playing, but more as an adventure game with action combat. Which to those people means that Skyrim is an action-adventure game. If you're playing a stealthy character, you're playing a stealth game. If you're playing a character that's an archer, you're playing a first-person shooter. See what I mean? Depending on how you play the game, the mechanics you encounter are going to be different. Meaning that for a lot of people, Skyrim is not an RPG. Just like with D&D, Skyrim encompasses many different genres. Let's play a little game. I have 14 games here, all of which are generally considered to be RPGs. Now let's see if you can figure out which of these games actually have role-playing mechanics in them and which ones don't. I'd say that about half of them have role-playing in them, with Mass Effect being kind of a stretch, as I think dialogue options with one-dimensional morality doesn't really count as role-playing. But now let's see if you can describe each of these games' genres without using the term role-playing. Try to name all the different styles of gameplay that exist in each game, and then I'll tell you what I think each gameplay style is like. Fallout is a turn-based tactical stealth conversation game. New Vegas is a first-person shooter stealth dialogue action game. Dark Souls is a methodical third-person action combat platformer. Pokémon is a turn-based strategy game. Mass Effect is a third-person shooter conversation game. And Final Fantasy VII is a semi-turn-based press the X button until you win minigame collection. You see how different these games are from each other when you ignore the levels, EXP and role-playing? To say that these games are the same genre is like saying apples and oranges are the same, because they're both fruits. Mass Effect may share some mechanics with Kingdom Hearts, but Kingdom Hearts in turn has just as much in common with Devil May Cry. Let's take a closer look at Kingdom Hearts. If you look at the gameplay, Kingdom Hearts isn't actually an RPG, but a 3D beat-em-up. Why? Because you go around beating things up in 3D, with a focus on combos. Now compare Kingdom Hearts to other beat-em-up games like Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, Darksiders and God of War. All these games are basically the same. They have the same core mechanics, but Kingdom Hearts isn't called a beat-em-up, it's called an RPG. And why? Because Square Enix says so? Because it has spells and experience points like in Final Fantasy? Which is funny, because Final Fantasy isn't even an RPG either. Just look at how characters like Sora and Bayonetta were adapted into Smash Bros. Both of these characters have movesets that use a lot of 3-hit combos, and because of that, play very similar to their original games. Meanwhile, characters that originate from turn-based games don't play at all like the games they came from, because the games they came from don't share any mechanics with Smash Bros. Their movesets had to be completely made from scratch, and the reason for this is because beat-em-ups are about fighting. Smash Brothers is a fighting game. The reason Ryu, Ken, Terry and Kazuya work so well in Smash is because they're all from fighting games. These games are very similar to Smash, so of course they work well together. Then there are game series that have basically completely changed genres. Take Fallout 1 and 2. Compared to Fallout 4 and New Vegas, Fallout 1 and 2 are turn-based games. But ever since Fallout 3 they all became first-person shooters. Then there's Final Fantasy games, which seem to change their mechanics so much with every game that it has gone through at least 4 completely different game styles. Which at that point you can't really claim they all belong to the same genre. Final Fantasy 1 has more in common with D&D than Final Fantasy 12, and Final Fantasy 15 has more in common with Kingdom Hearts than with Final Fantasy 4. But these games are all sequels to each other and all supposedly still belong to the same genre. Really with these games it's more about belonging to the same brands than belong to the same genre. But at least Fallout games still have a little bit of role-playing in them, excluding Fallout 76 and Tactics, I guess. At this point you may be thinking, does any of this really matter? So what if RPGs don't really have role-playing mechanics? You gotta call them something, right? What else are we going to do? Is it really that big of a problem? Well, I think it is, because a lot of people have trouble with finding the kind of games they like. Let's say you really like Dark Souls. Dark Souls is an RPG, allegedly. So you like RPGs. And then your friend goes, hey, you like RPGs? And you go, yeah, I like RPGs. So then they tell you to play, for example, Persona 5, which is an RPG, allegedly. And then you play it. And then you find that you don't really like it at all. You think that the turn-based battles are really boring. And then you blame this on the fact the game is turn-based. Which is just unfair, because there are plenty of people who like turn-based games. So who are you to declare that all RPGs should be action-based? After all, if you really like RPGs, surely you should be able to look past its combat system and enjoy it for its role-playing, right? But the joke here is that both Dark Souls and Persona 5 aren't even RPGs. Dark Souls is just an action game, and Persona 5 is just a turn-based game. The only thing they have in common is that they both have levels and experience points, neither of which have anything to do with role-playing. So why are they both called RPGs? How does this help people find the games they want to play? All it's doing is causing frustration and confusion. What happened here is that this person got sold a game they didn't want under the pretense that it's exactly what they want. Like, that's crazy, right? How is it useful? Who benefits from this? Why do we continue to use this term that 99% of the time does not even partially apply? And even when there are games that have RPG mechanics, they're only partly RPGs. This term doesn't mean anything. No one can even come up with a definition that fits. Games that are called RPGs have no role-playing in them. What is going on here? Well, do you really want to know? Because I think I know. This is a Skinner box. It's an experimental tool used to study animal behavior. It was invented by Boerus Frederick Skinner, after who it was also named. In its most basic form, it's a box with a pigeon or rat in it, with a lever, loudspeaker and light, where, if the animal presses said lever, a treat would be dispensed to the animal while a sound played and the lamp lit up. Skinner would then program the box so that the food would only be dispensed after a certain amount of lever presses, a time limit had passed, or a combination of these two. What Skinner discovered was that by doing this he could teach the animals to when and how often they were supposed to press the lever. He named his learning technique operant conditioning. There are many versions of the Skinner box, but I'm going to focus on one that is relevant to this video. In this Skinner box, the pigeon needs to press the lever multiple times to get the treat, and every time it gets one, the amount of presses required increases. What ends up happening is that the pigeon never stops pressing the lever. Even if the pigeon is already full, it will keep pressing it, not because it is hungry, but because it doesn't know if it will be able to get another treat when it needs to, and in an effort to optimize its income, will keep pressing the lever ad nauseum. This effect is known as the inconsistent win, and is caused by the way our brains process rewards. You see, when we get rewarded for something, our brains release dopamine, which is a motivational chemical, which is released when we do something that aids our survival, like eating, sexing, etc. When this happens, our brains remember what the action was that gave us the reward, and will then give us an additional dopamine shot whenever we perform that action again. This means that we don't necessarily need a reward to still get dopamine. And this is why the pigeon keeps pressing the lever. It's repeatedly getting rewarded for pecking the lever, and when the real reward finally comes, it's given an even bigger dopamine shot. The more pecks it took to get the reward, the more dopamine is given. Skinner also discovered two other important things. 1. Operant conditioning works on humans, and 2. Although physical rewards eventually reach a cap, social rewards, like compliments, money and fame, never do, meaning they can be used to condition forever. What's important to note is that this lever pushing thing is 100% not natural, meaning these animals would never have done these things repeatedly without being directly manipulated into doing it. So basically, Skinner boxes are about doing something you don't enjoy for an arbitrary amount of time or an arbitrary number of times to get a reward you actually want. So, what does this have to do with RPGs? Well, what mechanic do we know of that's all about rewarding you for doing something arbitrary? That's right, experience bars. And that's the secret. Experience bars aren't an RPG mechanic, they're a Skinner box mechanic. So then that begs the question, why is it that games that have these Skinner box mechanics are called RPGs? Because that sounds kind of dishonest if you ask me. If I'm going to buy an RPG, I expect role-playing, not operant conditioning. Now, I'm not going to say that every single game that has reward mechanics in it is an exploitative Skinner box. Take Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, for example. When you play a match of Smash Ultimate, at the end of a battle you get coins. These coins are rewards. However, no one's going to play Smash specifically to get these coins, which is why most people who play Smash a lot will have tens of thousands of these coins, because they don't actually care about them. They just like playing the game and the coins are a bonus. If the only fun thing to do in a game is to get rewards, players will focus their entire game plan around getting as many rewards as possible. In a good game, players will focus on having as much fun as possible. Smash is a fun game, regardless of the rewards. However, as part of a Skinner box, the repeating action has to be not fun to make the rewards seem actually rewarding. Otherwise, no one would care about the rewards. It needs to be exploitive in order to manipulate you into doing the repetitive action. The most common form of Skinner box mechanic has to be grinding. Take MMOs. Why is it that MMOs are so incredibly grindy? The reason is that MMOs have a subscription system. This means that every month you have to pay more to keep playing. To maximize profits, MMOs want you to keep playing for as long as possible. And in order to do that, they need to make it incredibly grindy, because the more grindy it is, the less content they have to produce. The same thing is true for live services like Anthem, Destiny and Marvel's Avengers. These games don't have subscription services, but they do have microtransactions, battle passes and loot boxes. So in order to get you to buy those, they have to keep you in the game for as long as possible. So you'll get an attachment to the game and make you feel comfortable in buying more stuff since you've already put so much time into it. This is actually a concept known as the sunk cost fallacy, and is a huge factor in a player's decision to keep playing the same game. This is another reason why these games will go out of their way to make themselves more grindy. Like how in Anthem and Destiny there used to be exploits that allowed you to get loot faster, which were then patched out. Marvel Avengers even got a patch that literally made the game more grindy, just to make its already dwindling player base play longer, so they could sell more battle passes to them. Even all the way back in the NES era, games were made more grindy on purpose. Take games like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest for example. Why did those games have such big overworlds with barely anything in it but random encounters? Well, it's to make you feel like the game is longer than it actually is, to make it feel like it's more valuable. It's true that a lot of games back then would be overly difficult to make them last longer to make it feel like you got your money's worth. But games like Final Fantasy make you do repetitive combat to raise your stats to an arbitrary point where you could finally defeat the next boss. So instead of designing the game in such a way that the combat was actually fun, so you'd want to play the game longer, they instead opted to just waste your time and manipulate you into thinking the game was worth more. So what I really want to emphasize here is that in all of these cases, these games were made more grindy, not to make them more fun, but to get more money out of you. And that's the thing with Skinner box mechanics. They are inherently exploitative. They are never put in to make games better. They are always put in there to get more money out of you. So now the question is, do game companies know that they're using exploitative Skinner box mechanics? I think the answer to that is yes, to an extent. I'm sure there's plenty of game companies that are using Skinner box mechanics without knowing their origins, especially indie creators, mainly because they are just copying mechanics from other games without fully understanding them. But there are plenty of game companies that know exactly that they're being exploitive. Maybe you've heard about this, but there are certain game companies that have actually been hiring psychologists to help them manipulate us to get us to buy more loot boxes and microtransactions. Now, you know who else is a psychologist? B.F. Skinner. So, how much are you willing to bet that the same psychologists that are teaching companies how to best manipulate us into buying loot boxes are also telling them about how to manipulate us with Skinner boxes? The Skinner box is extremely well known in the field of psychology, so surely they would know. But it gets even crazier than that, because you know what else is heavily rooted in Skinner box mechanics? Literal gambling.
The pigeon to the human case, because one of the schedules which is very effective with rats or pigeons is what we call the variable ratio schedule, and that is at the heart of all gambling devices and has the same effect. The pigeon can become a pathological gambler just as a person can. Now, the fact that we found that out with pigeons and could prove it by removing and changing the schedule makes it easy for us to interpret the case with the human subject. We don't say that the human subject gambles to punish himself, as the Freudians might say, or gambles because he feels excited when he does so. Nothing of the sort. People gamble because of the schedule of the reinforcement that follows, and this is true of all gambling systems. They all have variable ratios built into them. So what we've learned from the pigeon, it made it possible to interpret this vast field very effectively.
And there you go. B.F. Skinner himself explaining how gambling uses Skinner box mechanics to keep people gambling. The slot machines with the pulling off the handle, the flashing lights, the inconsistent win, all Skinner box mechanics used in the same way they're used to keep us playing. We can even see these effects in games like Overwatch. Remember that experience bar I was talking about just now? And what happens when you fill that experience bar? Exactly, you get a loot box. But of course in the beginning of the game you level up quickly, so you get a lot of loot boxes. But then comes a point where you don't level up as quickly. And what happens if there's a certain skin you want? Well, of course you're going to be conditioned to buy the loot boxes directly so that you don't miss out on the skin you want. Directly exploiting your FOMO. So you buy the loot boxes, you open them. But of course it doesn't have the skin you want. So now you are conditioned to buy even more loot boxes. You see what is happening here? It's basically a Skinner box comboing into another Skinner box. Of course, all of this doesn't stop at loot boxes. Microtransactions, battle passes, and any other monetization garbage you're likely to find in mobile games use some form of Skinner box to get you to buy it all. And although it may seem like this is all pretty recent stuff, video games back in the 80s and 90s already used these mechanics, mostly and unsurprisingly in casino games, but plenty of games had slot machine minigames that were programmed exactly like the ones in real casinos like Pokemon, Super Mario RPG, and Final Fantasy VII. Which means the developers of these games have known how to create a working Skinner box in-game since at least the 80s. So, what does any of this have to do with RPGs? Well, think about it. What has been the through line through all this? It's that all of these games that we've been told are RPGs and these mechanics that we've been told are RPG mechanics are actually just Skinner boxes and Skinner box mechanics respectively. The experience points, the levels, the grinding, all this time we've been exploited. We thought we were role-playing, but we were actually pulling the arm of a one-armed bandit. But that begs the question, why RPGs? Why call these games RPGs? Why not call them something else? Why not just be honest and say that they're Skinner boxes? Partially, D&D can be to blame because Dungeons & Dragons was one of the first games to use experience points and levels and all that. But even then, it doesn't make sense to stick with the word RPG, because it's not the levels and experience that make up role-playing. Surely someone somewhere in the entire video game industry must have realized that. Why not just change the name? Just be honest about it. But that's exactly the problem. The game industry can't be honest about it because the game industry needs to call Skinner boxes RPGs. Because it's not a genre name, it's a marketing term to hide the fact that they're selling you Skinner boxes.
Here you go, Mr. Rancher. I got your cattle bag for you.
Oh. Well, it doesn't matter now.
What do you mean?
In the 24 hours since the word veal was officially changed to little tortured baby cow, the market has gone dry. Seems when people see little tortured baby cow on their menus, they don't feel like ordering.
Really?
Yep, damn things ain't worth spit now. I'll let them live outside with the other cows and live a normal life.
This South Park clip is a great example of how marketing terms are used to sell us things we don't want. Here we see that the moment the name for veal was changed to tortured baby cow, people suddenly didn't want to buy it anymore, even though it was this exact same product. And why is that? Well, it's simply because the term tortured baby cow sounds negative. Which it is. Who would want to eat a baby cow? That sounds horrible.
Wait a minute. Veal is little baby cows?
Yepper.
Then why the hell do they call it veal?
Well, if we called it little baby cow, people might not eat it.
Yeah, I wouldn't have.
Meanwhile, people had no problem buying veal, and it's not like they didn't know it wasn't cow meat from young cows. And the funny thing is that tortured baby cow is a completely accurate description of the product. Like, that's what it is, right? Those were certainly baby cows, and they were certainly being tortured. And that's exactly the point of a bullshit marketing term. To trick customers into buying something they would normally never buy, by obscuring what it really is. The word veal is obscuring, It doesn't really mean that much to most people, it's just a piece of meat. But Tortured Baby Cow is descriptive. It tells a story, it says something about the piece of meat, and this is the same thing with RPGs. The word RPG is mostly meaningless to the point that everyone has a different idea about what it means. And because of that, game companies can call any game they want an RPG. And people will buy it no matter its actual mechanics, because they'll see the word RPG connected with other games that they like that were also called RPGs, no matter if they actually have anything in common with those games. And the crazy thing is that none of this is new. Corporations, including video game companies, do it all the time. Remember when EA tried to rebrand loot boxes as surprise mechanics? Remember when Bethesda tried to sell us paid mods but said they weren't paid mods because they didn't call them paid mods? Remember when Ubisoft tried to rebrand subscriptions as games you pay for multiple times? That one being extra funny because that's pretty much what a subscription is. Something you pay for multiple times. But that's the thing with rebranding words like this, is that these companies don't actually care what terms they use to describe things. They only care if these terms sound good or have negative connotations attached to them. In which case they will rebrand them specifically to avoid negative publicity. And that same thing has happened to RPGs. Where any company can make a game using skin-in-box mechanics, call it an RPG, and no one will ever be any wiser. Now imagine if game companies actually called their games skin-in-boxes. Would people still want to play them then? Right now, when people look up the word RPG, they'll find all these descriptions about how RPGs are about character development and storytelling. Meanwhile, if you look up the word skin-in-box, you'll mostly find info about how exploitative they are. At which point, most people would probably think twice about buying a game that's going to exploit them. A role-playing game is a game in which players assume the roles of characters in a fictional setting. Players take responsibility for acting out these roles within a narrative, either through literal acting or through a process of structured decision-making. Regarding character development, actions taken within minigames succeed or fail according to a formal system of rules and guidelines. There are several forms of role-playing games. The original form, sometimes called the tabletop role-playing game, is conducted through a discussion, whereas in live-action role-playing, players physically perform their character's action. In both of these forms, an arranger called a game master usually decides on the rules and setting to be used while acting as a referee. Each of the players takes control of a single character. Several varieties of RPG also exist in electronic media, that means video games, such as multiplayer text-based multi-dungeons and mods. It's like forums basically. And their graphics-based successors, massively multiplayer online role-playing games. Oh, okay. Immediately going to the MMOs, huh? Role-playing games also include single-player role-playing video games, in which players control a character or team of characters who undertake quests and may include player capabilities that advance using statistical mechanics. Oh, you mean like experience point, making numbers go up? These electronic games sometimes share settings and rules with tabletop RPGs, but emphasize character advancements more than collaborative storytelling. Oh, you mean so making numbers go up? Yeah, the collaborative storytelling, the role-playing, playing out characters. Yeah, they don't really do that, They're much more about character advancement, with stats and levels. Yeah, okay. So then we get down here. You got electronic media here. So we've got single player. Single-player role-playing video games form a loosely defined game genre of computer and console games, with origins in role-playing games such as Dungeons & Dragons, on which they base much of their terminology, settings, and game mechanics. This translation changed the experience of the game, providing visual representation of the world, but emphasizing statistical character development over collaborative interactive storytelling. So the same thing again. But then we got multiplayer here. Massively multiplayer online role-playing games combine the large-scale social interaction and persistent world of mods with graphic interfaces. Most MMOs do not actively promote in-character role-playing. They don't actively promote it, okay. So no role-playing in your MMO, but it's still an RPG. However, players can use the game's communication functions to role-play so long as other players cooperate. Well, that's nice. And what that's like? That's like Fallout 76. We thought how it was like, oh, well, the players will just make their own NPCs. They'll just be each other's NPCs. Problem with that is Fallout 76 wasn't exactly built around role-playing. It was built about looting. Just like how MMOs, like World of Warcraft, are also built around making, your stats go up. Like, you can't just be, I can roleplay in this game. Me and my sister, we used to roleplay in Super Smash Bros. Melee. Like, we used to play house. On, ONET and, Hyrule Temple. We'd pick a structure and that'd be our house. You can roleplay in any game. This is so fucking stupid. It's like, oh, you know, it's totally about roleplaying, you know. If you try hard enough, yeah, sure, there's no mechanics in the game that promote it. No. The majority of players in MMORPGs do not engage in role-playing in this sense. Well, I wonder why. What did they do then? Huh? What else do they do? Oh yeah, make their numbers go up. Yeah. So this entire article is essentially like dancing around the issue. Because whoever wrote this article is like, oh yeah, you got role-playing. Oh, I'm gonna write an article on that on Wikipedia. Okay, so you got like tabletop, you know, but then you also got like these video games, and they're not really about the same thing that tabletop RPGs are about. You know, they're actually more about, you know, but they got levels, you know, like in D&D. So I guess they're like, you know, it's more about making numbers go up. Yeah, so that's really cute. But here I got something better for you. Here, operant conditioning. Yeah, the operant condition, the Skinner box. Yeah, and a fun fact, like Skinner, he didn't actually like the name Skinner box. He didn't like being an eponym. He actually preferred lever box. But I mean, here they call it the operant conditioning chamber. But you know, Skinner box just rolls off the tongue. You know. So you got all the thing about the history and what it's used for. You know, like I talked about this already. But then down here, and this is good. This is a good one. Commercial applications. Commercial applications. Yeah, how do we make money with this shit? Yeah, put pitch in the box and like condition it to like press it, or it gets like electrocuted. Yeah, now commercial applications. 2 sentences. Both of these are gold. Fucking gold. Look at this shit. First sentence. Slot machines and online games. You know, and what are online games? Oh, they're MMOs. Massive multiplayer online game. Yeah, it's MMOs. Slot machines and online games are sometimes cited as examples of human devices that use sophisticated operant schedules of reinforcement to reward repetitive actions. Repetitive action, you mean like grinding? So here we got this article that's like oh yeah, MMOs, yeah, no, people don't really role-playing them, but I guess you could, you know, like they're more about statistical advancement. And in here, the page on like Skinner boxes, it's like, oh yeah, no, exactly like MMOs. Oh, and gambling too. Yeah, no, it's Skinner boxes. Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, like nothing about it. Like it's literally Skinner boxes. But then it gets even better because we got the second one. Gamification, the technique of using game design elements in non-game contexts, has also been described as using operant conditioning and other behaviorist techniques to encourage desired user behaviors. And you want to know why? That's because gamification, it's Skinner boxification. It's all about using extrinsic motivators like rewards to get people to do what you want. That's all what it's about. You know the episode of SpongeBob? Like with the employee of the month? You know, in that episode, Squidward tells SpongeBob the only reason that Mr. Krabs awards SpongeBob with a reward is to make him work harder. Which is correct. But of course, like as the episode goes on, like Squidward wants to stick it to SpongeBob that much that he essentially becomes enamored with it too. And at the end of the episode, they're fucking insane. Like they're fucking pulling giant boat anchors and boats. And that's an extrinsic motivator. Because Mr. Krabs, you know, what he could do is just pay SpongeBob and Squidward more money to motivate them. Because money is also an extrinsic motivator. But they can't do that because that costs money. But like a social reward, like being the best, like being at the top of a leaderboard, that's like infinite. It doesn't cost any money. And on top of that, like these employees will just fight each other. So it's a great way for you to not even spend money. And your employees will just kind of want to work harder in order to beat each other. And this should fucking terrify you, right? That Skinner boxes and video games, that Skinner box mechanics are so ubiquitous in video games that they are synonyms of each other. Because of course, like gamification, it sounds better. It does, like it sounds way better than Skinner boxes. And that's why they call it that. Because Skinner box vacation, you know, you get to a class of kids and it's like, hey kids, if you do your homework, I give you a gold star. You know, it's gamification. The kids are like, wow, I love video games. Now you go to the same class and tell them, oh yeah, we're going to do Skinner boxification, kids. Those kids, they don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Skinner boxes, what the fuck is that? And then they look it up. It's like, oh, I'm being treated like a pigeon. But that's what's happening. Like, you could also like pay to get, or like have some learn things that are actually fun, or give your employees actual money, or more breaks or something. No, because that costs money. That's the thing about video games, is that they're just skinner boxes now, like so many. Like, it's ubiquitous. Every reward mechanic in the game is an extrinsic motivator. It's a form of conditioning. This is so fucked up, and this whole article is in denial over it. Because it doesn't add up, right? Like, why are MMOs called RPGs? Why are all these like games called RPGs? There's no role-playing in them. Like, does anyone really role-play that much in Skyrim either? Not really. Pokemon, Final Fantasy, like, they don't have role-playing mechanics. It's so in denial, and then you got the Skinner box, and it's just like, yeah, no, gambling, MMOs, games, Skinner boxes. Holy fuck. Just imagine the Game Awards where instead of best RPGs of the year, they'd have the best Skinner boxes of the year. Imagine Steam having an entire section dedicated to different kinds of Skinner boxes. That wouldn't look very appealing, would it? It just goes to show how important appearance is. How it doesn't matter what things are, but what they appear to be. And you can see how this can be used to sell anything to anyone. Because if anyone dares to question your product and say it's something you don't want it to be perceived as, you can just point to the name you gave it and act like they just don't understand what they're talking about. Not only that, but people will actually use this exact logic to justify to themselves why they like games that, when you describe them, don't actually sound all that good. Take, for example, Final Fantasy VII. What I've noticed is that whenever people talk about Final Fantasy VII, they only ever talk about the cutscenes and the story. They never talk about the gameplay. At best, they proclaim that they tolerate it.
For me, I played through the fights in Final Fantasy VII in order to get access to more of the story. The activity of actually doing the fights themselves wasn't all that engaging. It wasn't what I was playing them for. Rather, I was wading through them because I had to in order to get something else I wanted.
This seems weird, right? After all, if people only like the story of a game and don't enjoy the gameplay, then why don't they say it's a good game? Why did they come out of the experience saying they enjoyed themselves when they find that most of what they do in the game is boring? Now, I've played Final Fantasy VII myself, and I found that combat boiled down to trading blows with the enemy, healing when you're at low health, and when you get your limit break, you use it instantly to defeat the enemy in most cases, while they don't really do anything back in return. There was no strategy to it, no reason to use status moves, no reason to consider type effectiveness. Even using elemental magic was pointless, since it did comparable damage to your melee attack, and would just waste your MP. The entire process boiled down to pressing the X button until a meter fills, then watch a cool animation as damage numbers appear. So, if the combat of Final Fantasy VII is so bad, then why do people tolerate it? Simple. It's because Final Fantasy VII itself is a Skinner box. Remember how Skinner boxes are about rewarding you for doing menial tasks? The gameplay of Final Fantasy VII is set up the same way. The combat is there to make you press buttons. When the damage numbers appear, cool animations play and experience bars go up, you get small amounts of dopamine to keep you pressing more buttons. Then, after you've fought a certain number of battles, you get a cutscene or a piece of the story, the thing you actually want. And that is when you get the big dopamine hit. And because the player doesn't know how many battles they need to fight to get to the next cutscene, your brain just keeps pumping more dopamine into you in anticipation. This is the infrequent win aspect of the Skinner box. This is why people are fine with the terrible combat. The pressing of the X button is similar to pulling the lever on a slot machine. Neither are enjoyable activities by themselves, but the cool animations, sound effects, and the promise of a reward keep players playing the Skinner box. And this is why the gameplay has to be boring on purpose, because Square Enix didn't want you to use strategy and tactics. They just wanted to make you press the X button an arbitrary number of times before giving you the next cutscene, because if the combat were good, people wouldn't care that much about the reward. The Skinner box makes the cutscenes and story look better, because by needing to put in extra effort into getting a cutscene, it makes the dopamine hit when you finally get it bigger. So not only is Final Fantasy VII a Skinner box, but it being a Skinner box actually makes the story look better. And that would be fine if the game was actually advertised as a Skinner box, because then people could at least make an informed decision on whether to buy the game. The problem is that Square Enix isn't advertising the game as a Skinner box, but as an RPG, even though there's absolutely no role-playing to be found in it. Doesn't that bother you? That you are being told that you are role-playing while you are really just packing a button over and over until you get a treat? That you are being treated like an animal?
Every time you click that thing, I get another treat. Do more! Forget the treats. Those clicks are giving me all the juice I need.
I'm sure a lot of you are still not convinced. Partly by me taking a shit on one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time. So let's take a look at a game that is the opposite of that. Let's take a look at Raid Shadow Legends. Now you might say that this is an apples to oranges example, as Raid Shadow Legends is a shitty, self-playing, pay-to-win mobile game. Is it? Raid Shadow Legends, just like Final Fantasy VII, is called an RPG by their developers. Yet just like with Final Fantasy VII, if you actually look at the gameplay, you'll see that Raid Shadow Legends, just like Final Fantasy VII, is a skinner box. A scam disguised as a game where all you do is watch numbers go up while you don't actually partake in any real gameplay. Both these games are called RPGs. Neither of these games have role-playing in it. Both have boring gameplay that is more about watching numbers go up and getting extrinsic rewards than actually having fun with the gameplay itself. And I agree 100% that Raid Shadow Legends is way more exploitative. But both still use the same mechanics. They're cut from the same cloth, and let's not forget Square Enix has released some shit mobile games of its own, like Final Fantasy All the Bravest. And this isn't just Final Fantasy VII. This is most RPGs, especially JRPGs. You may have noticed that up to this point I have not talked about the differences between Western RPGs and JRPGs. However, that's just because there isn't that much to say about it. Look, you want to know what the difference is? Western RPGs tend to have at least a little bit of role-playing in them, along with some choices about the pacing of the game and where the story is going. This is because most Western RPGs, to an extent, try to recreate the D&D experience in video game form. JRPGs, however? Skinner boxes with anime plots. Every single one of them. Hell, I almost completely stopped calling them JRPGs. Because they're not RPGs, they're anime Skinner boxes. That's what I call them. Because at their core, they're really just anime that have been smushed into Skinner boxes to make them look somewhat like video games. And what's really sad is that of all video games that are called RPGs right now, I'd surmise that about 90% of them are anime Skinner boxes. Which isn't surprising seeing how fast those things are cranked out, because of how easy it is to make a Skinner box. That's pretty fucked up, right? The vast majority of games that are called RPGs have absolutely no role-playing in them. Imagine being a sheep farmer, having 100 sheep, and then one day you find out 99 of them are actually wolves in sheep clothes. And on top of that, how many people exist in the world that would love role-playing games, but don't know because they've never played an actual role-playing game while thinking they have? What I'm really trying to get across in this video is, do you see how normalized Skinner box mechanics are in games? We've been describing hundreds to thousands of video games using what is essentially a completely useless term, and no one really cared too much about it. Sure, plenty of people try to rationalize which games the term RPG should apply to according to which rules. But eventually those people who tried had to give up when they couldn't come up with a definition that covered all the games that were called RPGs by their creators. So if these terms are so useless, why do we keep using them? Why do we keep using stupid terms that don't actually tell us anything about the gameplay? Metroidvanias, Soulsborns, roguelikes, walking simulators, point-and-click adventure games. Some of these are named after other games, some of these after the input systems. It's also useless. How do any of these terms accurately describe the gameplay of these games? They don't. So then how should we describe games? Simple. Describe them. All we have to do is be descriptive. Instead of using fake terms that only obscure the game's true machinations, just describe the game mechanics that are present in the game. It's the same thing I did earlier in this video. Metroid games become platform shooter maze backtracking games. Souls-likes become action combat Skinnerbox exploration games. Roguelike is just a stupid term anyway, since Rogue was originally inspired by D&D. Really, a roguelike is any game that has both random level generation and permadeath. So instead of saying that a game is a roguelike, just say it has those mechanics.
I just want to point out that this game is advertised as a roguelike, and maybe my understanding of what a roguelike is wrong, but I'm going to restart at the beginning of this level with the same weapons that I had the last time I was in it. Okay.
Let me finish this video by telling you a story on how I used this system to find the exact kind of game I was looking for. So about 5 years back I was looking around on one of those Play NES games in your browser websites, where I found this game called Dungeons & Dragons Pool of Radiance. Now what's really cool about this game is that it's a real advanced Dungeons & Dragons module adapted into an NES game. Meaning that playing this game is basically like playing an entire D&D campaign all by yourself, where you control all the characters. It also came out 2 years earlier on PC, which was better in some ways, like having a larger possible party size. However, I found the NES version pretty satisfactory. I played it a few times from the beginning, trying out different party lineups, basically using trial and error to figure out all the game mechanics, and after a while I decided I liked the game so much that I downloaded a ROM and played it all the way through. At the end of the journey, I found that my main complaint with the game was that it wasn't polished enough, which was mostly caused by it being an NES game from 1992. The AI is pretty stupid and never uses spells, most spells don't have any use or don't seem to work, thieves are completely useless since they can't disarm traps or lockpick, there is only one combat music track, but the thing with all these problems is that these can all be solved with a remake or a sequel, because the basic game and quest design was pretty good. So after playing this, I went looking for more games that were exactly like it. After all, surely there wouldn't be a lack of D&D inspired games, right? Well, not exactly. I played Baldur's Gate, Planescape Torment, Fallout, Divinity, Wizardry, The Bard's Tale and plenty more. I even tried playing another Pool of Radiance game from 2001, but that one didn't really feel like work on a computer made after the year 2001. The problem with all these games though is that none of them really scratched the same itch Pool of Radiance did. For most of them it was the combat system. Pool of Radiance had this very simple, easy to comprehend turn-based combat system that took place on a square grid. But a lot of these games were more action-oriented, which was fine, but also meant that strategy and tactics are very much on the back foot, along with action-based not really being in the spirit of D&D. Then for others the problem I had with them was that I could only make and control one character, or they didn't have the spell selection I was looking for. The way that I found all these games was that I would search on the internet for D&D-like RPGs, which made me realize that I was looking in the wrong way. Instead of looking for games that had things in common with D&D, I should have been looking for games that had the exact mechanics that I enjoyed so much in Pool of Radiance. You see, the truth is that even though I've talked a lot about RPGs in this video, I don't actually care that much about role-playing myself. No, the reason I play RPGs is mostly because of the quests and the turn-based strategic and tactical combat. So from then on I stopped using the word RPG in my searches, and I made a list of all the mechanics that I liked and would compare a game's mechanics to the list and try to find the game with the most matches. This list included must allow me to make a party of different classes, must have quests, must have spells that can also be used outside of battle, and must have turn-based combat that takes place on a square grid. Using this list, I finally found a game that hit most of the must-haves. That game being Shadowrun Returns. Okay, so this game didn't adhere exactly to the list. It was surprisingly linear, actually. I could only create the main character, but it was turn-based. It did have quests, and it did have a square grid. Also, in case you didn't know, Shadowrun, just like D&D, was originally a tabletop RPG, which explains why they're so similar. And you know what? Close enough. For now. Sure, I still haven't found that perfect game, but who knows? Maybe I'll end up making that game myself. We'll see. What I do know though is that if I had focused my search entirely around finding other games in the RPG genre, I would have had to wade through hundreds, if not thousands of Skinner boxes that would have had no mechanics in common with Pool of Radiance, except that they both would have had experience points and levels, which if you look at my list isn't even a necessity. Hell, at this point I would actually prefer it to not have any experience points, because the less Skinner box mechanics, the better.
Where does that leave free will? Because we all think we have a choice of whether to do things or not to do things.
Yes. Well, you see, it leaves it in the position of a fiction. We have assumed somehow or other that these internal states, feelings, and so on have initiated something. They have started something. They have created. We have done something in a voluntary way. We have willed to act. If you now look at the actual history, we find that there are external reasons why this has happened. In other words, by discovering the causes of behavior, we can dispose of the imagined internal cause. We dispose of free will as an American divine of the 18th century, Jonathan Edwards, did. He said, we believe in free will because we know about our behavior, but not about its causes. And of course, it's the object of a science of behavior to discover causes. And once you have found those causes, there is less you need to attribute to an internal act or will, and eventually I think you need to attribute nothing to it.